Okay, lovely. So I've got to make sure my mic doesn't flop around apparently. So, Uncle Ray.
Yo.
Yeah, yo. Mary talked a lot about how cooperation in the Arctic Circle has led to empowerment for Inuit communities, particularly around language. And I just wondered, what do you think the role of Indigenous cooperatives could have for self-determination for Indigenous peoples?
Firstly, in many of the desert communities, we could take away the basic card and empower the people through businesses. That's the first thing. I mean, I've just finished a UN mandated conference up in Port Douglas there on climate crisis throughout the whole of the Pacific. All those Pacific nations are suffering a lot of the climate change things. And after hearing our auntie here, you can see the possibilities of cooperatives operating in that particular region there, right throughout from Australia through to Papua New Guinea, right across to Fiji, the Hawaiians. A lot of those countries are, well, as you know, Kiribati and Kiribati probably be gone in about 3 years. And so their concerns are food security, water security, air security, and they're the main things. I mean, food security is not just only on the land, but also in the waters. And so those issues are really, really powerful at the moment. And there is no ways in which we can stem the flow of what's happening. And we're related, actually, the Pacific Ocean has a huge effect on the Arctic, because when it melts there, we've got about a 7 or 8 inch sea rises here, which is really a double concern for us. So I think there's huge, big opportunities for cooperatives operating in this whole region here. But in Australia here, one little story, I suppose. One of the problems that a lot of our communities face is incarceration. And if you bring any of those men or women out of that, it's very difficult for them to get a job. And so I've always encouraged them, go and, be a sole trader or something, and start a business. And you can make your own policies around, whether you hire someone with a criminal record or not. But you can see how cooperatives could actually change that. I can tell you the difficulties that we have. Take, for example, in the Northern Territory, and see the Northern Territory under the Land Rights Act, or the Wood Royal Commission, they got freehold title. And just think about it. Freehold title. That's an asset that they could use. The problem they have, and I don't know what it's like in Canada, but the problem they have is that they stuck the freehold title into a trust. And so you've got the land councils. And so the people on the ground are just beneficiaries. And we're trying to figure out how to change the beneficiaries into something that they can control themselves. And I think cooperatives are the ways in which we could possibly be more radical about how we change that perception of the beneficiaries. And that's not only in Northern Territory. I mean, we've got throughout Queensland here, we've got a number of Doggett communities as well. So we're just trying to figure out how would you say, if they want to use those kind of legislative programs, how do we manipulate them for our own benefit?
So Uncle Ray's doing a really good job of being both a speaker and a facilitator.
Sorry.
Because, no, it's making my job really easy. Because he's looking at Mark, and he obviously wants Mark to have something to say about that. I mean, Mark, given all your work with Indigenous peoples and organisations around the law, where do you think the opportunities are, but particularly in relation to raise a kind of provocation that cooperatives are the best way to be able to shift some of those legislative systems that are perhaps getting in the way? if indeed you think they are?
I mean, going to first principles, I mean, when you look at the structure of the corporation, the company law says that the management must put the interest of the company first. And the benefit of the cooperative, of course, is that flips that on its head. It says it must, the board must put the interest of the members first, whereas in the corporate structure, that is almost illegal to be delivering the interests to the membership first. And so that's a very, very powerful flip. What is one of the poor outcomes of the native title structure is that whilst it delivers, in effect, the residue of the sovereign rights of Indigenous First Nations people of this country, it leaves them with an asset that effectively can't be dealt with. The banks don't recognise the value in the land in the way, so it's a white fella superimposition to try and bring that land within the universe of the common law as the British law then recognised it. But there's an infinite way in which the cooperative is going to work, and I'll be as brief as possible. The core benefit of the cooperative is to take the small interests of many where private interest wouldn't see the profit-driven worth of operating in that space. The cooperative accumulates that and creates a sufficient interest to allow something to operate and grow in that space. And one of the great lessons from what Mary was saying is when you look at the on-station supply of groceries in the Western Australia, Northern Territory, remote New South Wales and Queensland, hugely expensive. It's part of what the pastoral grazier has as their business plan, is the supply of groceries to the local Indigenous populations. Just think how the world would transform for those people if they could do a Cooperative Supermarkets Australia, bring themselves together and get consolidated group purchasing power and supply in that space. And I think, you know, there is a wonderful lesson once again from the Canadian model that I would see as capable of being embraced. Now that can be repeated in so many levels, and I know that the BCCM is super active in that space with the Kakadu Plum and Original Power co-ops that have been recently spawned.
And we're keeping her here.
Yeah.
Kidnap.
She might have something to say about that. Mary, you touched on it in your presentation, but how do you think the wider sort of legislative and financial services framework in Canada supports or not the cooperatives?
So Arctic Cooperative tend to partner with organization, and I talked about logistically, we partner with a sea lift company out of Quebec, and we partner with an airline that supplies the Eastern Canada. We recently partnered with the First Nation Bank, which is a chartered bank out of Saskatchewan. So we're a shareholder now. And these communities don't have the banking services because of the remoteness. And they look at, well, there's challenges. There's no network up there. Well, there is. I could actually FaceTime with my mom from here in the Arctic region. So it's available. One of the things, barriers is always talked about in these communities. And that's something is that unbury, like stop looking at the barriers and do the action. Because from the Arctic perspective, the banking services, it's easier to set up something in Africa, in the remote community, than it is in the Indigenous community. So why is that mindset is always there? And it's easy in the sense of these other locations in the third world country than it is in the Indigenous communities. But we do partner with the First Nation Bank, and there's some kiosks in this location. Because of the regulation, we also have to look at it from that side of things. So we have to be careful as well, but we try to find ways around them. We always say we find ways around them. We do try to find ways around them, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so Ray, just picking up on Mary's thing there about how barriers are so much often a part of the discourse. This is what we might call a deficit discourse that is so often the way we think about and talk about Indigenous communities and even Indigenous organisations. How do we shift that, Ray? Like, how can co-ops help to shift that discourse?
Well, we thought we'd get that on the 14th of this month, but that dream was dashed and buried, and we have to rise again. And I think one of the things, I know Melina and I would agree that one of the problems we have is legislation. We did have cooperatives, and they were the first structures that we employed back in the 50s and 60s to look after our housing needs, our health needs, and all those kind of things. But when the Corporations Act came into play in 1975, we've all had to come under the Corporations Act, and therefore it stopped us from being a cooperative. And we lost a lot of assets and lost a lot of things there. And I think there is a resurgence now of trying to figure out what kind of structures is the best structure for us to advance. And I can't think of another better one than either the CME sector to help us to do that together. And the CATSI Act, for example, that's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act, is under the, if you've got shares, a company can issue shares to its members, as you know. But under the CATSI Act, the Aboriginal Act, members of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander corporation cannot own or trade shares. So we've got a deficit there, right there in the Act itself, that stops us from doing what we would like to do. So therefore, if that Act doesn't work, then we have to go to a cooperative where it's membership driven.
Okay. So one of the things that struck me listening to Melina and listening to Terry was the word value creation, measurement of value. Can each of you in turn just reflect on what does value creation look like? And maybe Mary, you could start with this because you've demonstrated it quite powerfully in your presentation. What does value creation look like for cooperatives working with local communities?
I've touched on a number of things in the presentation and the value of community-owned businesses. I think that's the number one foundation in these communities, and the value of being part of an organization that is going to have an impact. And I think that's one of the things that is the value, the inclusiveness, because we're in Southern Canada, the inclusion, we often talk about inclusiveness, and one of the things is that always keeping in mind that we're serving these communities, and the value is just so important to make sure that we always have that foundation of value in that they're own in these remote communities. So that's what I can respond to on that one. Yeah.
I guess I was also thinking about how value is created in at lots of different levels.
Exactly.
Like there's financial value,
Exactly.
obviously, social and financial inclusion of those communities.
Yeah.
But what extent do you also think there's cultural value that's created, or at least sustained through forming a cooperative, being part of a cooperative?
Well, we also have to keep in mind the language, our Indigenous language are very diverse, and it's not just the Inuit communities. Because I'm an Inuk, I tend to forget the Dene communities and then First Nation communities, but I have to keep that in mind as well. And so, and the value, the culture, the diversity of these ones, the value of the cooperative movement is voicing their opinion, and that's so important, is voicing their opinion. That I think Uncle Ray talked about the cooperative movement, is to ensure that we keep that in mind as a value, because it is their culture, it is the culture that they're reserving. A lot of times that we forget that these things, when we're doing business, is that they're very tiny little communities, and then how do we serve them? Because we tend to hear it from this perspective,
yes,
and then trying to make sure that there's going to be an impact, whatever decision that we're making.
So Uncle Ray, would you like to reflect also on that? Like, how do cooperatives, what value can they create, or have you seen them create through Tranby, for example, hugely long-running educational cooperative in Sydney? Like, what value is created beyond basic, well, important economic value, but what other types of value do you think are being created?
Ownership, self-determination. In a cooperative, ownership is typically held by the members. That's the big difference. Whereas in a corporation, ownership is represented by shares of stocks. In a cooperative, governance of cooperative businesses are democratically governed, whereas in corporations they're governed by a board of directors. And we're very used to that kind of stuff at the moment. In terms of purpose, cooperatives are usually found to provide goods or services to their members at a fair price, whereas corporations are primarily established to generate profits. Even a not-for-profit is there for profit, because they have to demonstrate they have a profit in order to share not-for-profit, be a not-for-profit. So profit distributions, capital raising, all of these kinds of things are very, very valuable for a cooperative in our communities. And I think the challenge we have at the moment is that we have to have a new educational program to help our people understand what systems are, what structures are, but also what the cooperative structure can offer.
Yes, because we saw it sort of quite powerfully last night. Like the politician, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, that came. I mean, I don't mean this as disparaging. There's a lot of ignorance around cooperatives, and I think also that would extend into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities for sure. But we see powerful examples of that. I've done work with Traditional Credit Union. I mean, it's a very powerful example of an organisation that is doing a lot of the important work of providing safe financial services into those remote communities, and in that creates a lot of value beyond that as well. So Mark, you've done a lot of work with Indigenous organisations, worked with Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of non-Indigenous people in the room. Like, what have you taken away from that? What do you think is really important in ensuring that those partnerships succeed?
Look, I think if you go to a community like Pormpuraaw up in Cape York, one of the first things that any of the traditional owners there is going to do is take you to the crocodile farm. They're so utterly proud of this achievement that they have there. And it's very much something that echoes exactly what Pastor Ray was saying. It's about self-determination and most importantly, self-respect. So I think there lies, one of the core deliverables, that being able to have a structure that the whole of the community can participate in sits. And we look at Original Power's efforts at the moment in the Northern Territory to do solar arrays that are specific to a community, feeding into the Northern Territory grid, relieving energy poverty in the local community, energy available to create cool rooms and establish businesses. This is tremendous thinking. This is, really, and it's theirs, and so that is one of the most important features, I think, too, and particularly advisors that go into these spaces. And I congratulate Anthony Taylor in this space because he does this terrifically well. It's not us doing it. It's us facilitating it and helping people do it, helping the community do it. So, they're the key takes for me in being able to participate in that space. In so many ways, me making myself irrelevant is one of the great achievements in the space, but being available is another aspect.
Leanne, if take one region that we don't talk about too often, which is the Torres Straits, and they're on Thursday Island. It's a really well-established community up there, very different to the Aboriginal community. And I rang them up the other day and I said, do you have a cooperative? They said, oh yeah. I said, do you own it? I said, no. And yet there's an opportunity. If they would have saw Mary's presentation here today, they probably would have went up there and started their own cooperative to actually work out how they can, work through a different way, a different vision. And the problem we have today here for us as Aboriginal people is that we're locked into a very deficit type vision, and that is close the gap. And that's not a vision. And I think the business community, BCCM, you've got a big job to do with us. I'm looking forward to working with you, particularly Paul. I want his bank details later and his PIN number. I've always been a member of a credit union because that's membership driven, and I enjoy the membership. And I think our people, the cooperative model fits deeply well within our Aboriginal cultural values and our cultural ways as a membership driven organisation, and we have to go back to that.
Thank you, Ray. I mean, I think that that just seems to sum it all up beautifully, doesn't it? There's a lot of cooperatives in this room, lots of opportunities. It says in the Doing Business report that Indigenous businesses is like this sleeping giant. So, and Mary pointed to the fact that, that when there's I think it was your hometown, there's the commercial businesses coming in and you're concerned for that. I think cooperatives need to seize the moment, because that's how we can ensure those important issues around self-determination and voice and reconciliation could be part of doing business in Indigenous communities. I'm conscious of the time, Melina. Do we want to go to a question on the Slido, or we just wrap it up? Yeah, I want to wrap it up. Yeah. I mean, they're not going anywhere, so please give your questions, but be careful for, there's all opportunities. But I think one of the other things that came out in Mary's presentation was this thing around voice and listening. I mean, in my work that I've done with Indigenous peoples and organisations, listening is just so important. And so I just think, let's listen and let's learn and let's seek those opportunities. And I just want to thank Mary and Ray and Mark for their insights today, and I hope you've found it inspiring and you're starting to see opportunities for yourself to start servicing Indigenous communities in your areas. So thank you so much. Thank you.